The following program is produced by Pacific Vista Productions. Welcome to City Arts of San Francisco, a remarkable gathering of writers and performing artists in a series of talks and onstage conversations celebrating the life of the mind. This is Matt Elmore for your host, Maya Angelou. Our guest is British novelist John le Carre, the undisputed master of the spy novel. Le Carre's rumpled protagonist, George Smiley, is the unlikely hero of a series of enormously popular Cold War espionage thrillers, including Tinker Tailor, Soldier Spy, The Little Drummer Girl, and The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. In contrast to the suave, superhuman British agents in other contemporary spy fiction, John le Carre portrays Smiley as an ordinary, somewhat lonely, middle-aged man who battles bureaucratic red tape with the Foreign Office as often as he outmaneuvers Soviet agents on the streets of Berlin. In his recent works, The Night Manager and Our Game, John le Carre introduces his readers to a new arena of intrigue where Cold War rivalries between the East and West have been supplanted by warring international cartels of arms dealers and drug smugglers. He delves into the politics of the breakaway republics of the former Soviet Union and investigates the newly emerging superpower, the Moscow Mafia. John le Carre uses spellbinding, often elegant prose to describe his highly believable characters and the authentic settings of his stories. A graduate of Oxford University, le Carre spent 5 years in the British Foreign Service and was involved in intelligence activities throughout West Germany. In the 1960s, he served as second secretary in the British Embassy in Bonn and as consul in Hamburg. John le Carre is heard here in a rare on-stage interview hosted by writer and international affairs expert Orville Schell in a program presented for the Friends of the Library at the Herbst Theater in San Francisco.
Well, thank you, and welcome, John. Perhaps we ought to let you in from the cold and acknowledge your real name, which we'll be using this evening, David Cornwell, for those of you who did not already know it. Pleasure to have you in San Francisco.
Thank you very much.
Well, we won the Cold War. What did we win?
Well, who's we?
Well, let's take it side by side.
There was a very stormy, unloved comedian who said in Berlin, the right people lost and the wrong people won, which was a very cruel epitaph to the Cold War. If he meant by that it was a triumph of materialism over a misplaced humanist dream that went completely wrong, then I think he has a point. What troubles me about our supposed victory is that it seemed to me there was no shouting in the streets. I heard no church bells. I don't think we had a contingency plan for victory. I don't think that we actually even enjoyed the victory very much. We didn't come out of the trenches and hug our former enemies. I don't remember a Peace Corps being put together for young American kids to go and visit their former Soviet counterparts, to go and find out what on earth it was that this dreadful experiment went so wrong. So I think that we've won, yes, and your response in America and ours in Europe, I think, have been comparably unworthy of the aspirations that we all had when we were fighting the Cold War. I think we have a little ground to catch up on that front. Let me stop there.
Do you imagine that what won was, in effect, the marketplace rather than democracy?
I think what was defeated, first of all, was a perversion of humanity. What began as a great scheme of human partnership a great endeavor, however misinterpreted, to release the forces of mankind. What was offered very often to emerging nations as a flag behind which they could march, wrongly, what too often was a perversion of legitimate nationalism, all of that went through a hole in the ground when the Cold War was over. And I think that many of the humanist concerns that we had at that time have somehow disappeared with the disappearance of the struggle.
Do I detect a kind of a discouraged idealist in these comments?
Well, we're talking in historical terms of the blink of a star, of no time at all. And I really think you as really the only superpower at present, very understandably will be going through a fascinating period of self-examination, self-analysis. I don't think that the United States is becoming isolationist, turning in upon itself in a negative sense. But I do think this is one of the moments when having really saved the world twice in my lifetime, where you've come out of the ring and said, actually, that's enough for the time being. We'll consider ourselves and find out how we are. I don't think it's a period that can last very long, not to keep the world safe.
Did you consider yourself an anti-communist?
Absolutely dyed in the wool, yes.
And so then that raises the question of, if you're an anti-communist, you are a pro-what?
Well, I guess that I would call myself, in English terms, a social democrat. I would not be ashamed in some ways to call myself a socialist in the old sense, in the Fabian sense. I guess I'm just another goofy liberal Brit.
I want to read something that you wrote. I'm not sure whether this comes under the rubric of a goofy liberal Brit, but you say, in our society, most of us live in a condition of secrecy, secret desire, secret appetites, secret hatreds, and relationships with the institutions, which is extremely intense and uncomfortable. These, to me, are part of the ordinary human condition. So I don't think I write about abnormal things. That sounds, first of all, it doesn't sound very Californian, does it?
No, I guess it's not. It certainly sounds to me very personal. It sounds peculiar to my own life. I can't think where I wrote it, but I already regret it. The thing is that certainly in my life, the nature of the society I served was delivered to me by the institutions in which I was confined. They were not penal, though nearly they were. If you knew the British educational system, you would consider them semi-penal. And because I went to my first boarding school when I was 5 years old, I had the peculiar experience of my mother disappearing from our lives when I was very young, and having a very wayward, colorful father who was outside prison a lot. And the consequence was that as I grew up, I was looking to institutions to supply the meaning of life, quite simply. And, if you will, the meaning of patriotism, too. It was a very easy thing to do in Britain in those days, because we still considered ourselves, when I grew up, a colonial, imperial nation with a political duty to fulfill. We were going to run bits of the world. The career officer at my first private school was telling us that we should go to Kenya and run Kenya, that we should go to India even. The Indian civil service was still on offer. I was therefore brought up to some notion of service in a patriotic sense, which would be enshrined in the institutional connection. And I guess that the disenchanted romantic in me is the child who's never grown up, who finds those institutions repeatedly flawed. So that's the personal background to that rather disenchanted note you read.
Where does one turn for institutions or any sort of aspect of public life that would help us be somewhat idealistic? Do you find that as you've grown older, you've become more discouraged that such things will come to pass?
No, I don't. I couldn't say that. I think that my sons, of whom I have 4, live in a better world than I did. I think they're nicer people. Those that are married are better parents than I was. They have a better attitude to their kids, much greater sense of social responsibility. They're far more truthful innately than we were. They're not so discriminatory. We in the schools I went to, anti-Semitism was a given. That was a European upper-class posture that you had to work out of your system. And the same with the so-called minority races. I mean, we were brought up to these charming drawing room English versions of neo-Nazi doctrine, but re-enshrined in graceful, amusing atmosphere. So I think that in many ways it's a much better world, and it will reshape itself very well. I'm not so impatient as to think it will happen in my lifetime. I think huge changes are upon us. I mean, I think the nation state, sooner or later, must disappear. I think most of our humanitarian concerns for one another are transnational, and supranational.
We see the most rabid forms of nationalism
Yes.
developing everywhere.
Well, that's the convenient retreat from that, of course. And the more dismaying life becomes and the more choices, the more certain you can be that the neo-fascist reaction, the intolerant reaction, will exist side by side with the reforms. The really important thing, I guess, is that with the pace and immensity of life and the pace of communication and so on, that we do preserve our faith in the value of the individual over the collective, which, if you remember, is one of the things we fought the Cold War for.
What do you think the United States should have done that it did not do during the Cold War? I mean, what would have been a more...
During the Cold War, I don't think that the United States really put a serious foot wrong. I think that in the making of the Cold War, there were terrible miscalculations on both sides, but principally on the Western side. But ironically, the kind of liberal posture that many people preached during the Cold War, you can't preach a posture but adopt it, turned out to be false. I mean, I believed, even as a young diplomat serving in Germany, that the East German regime was not as bad as it was painted, and I despised our propaganda machine. It turned out to be far worse. So I don't think in the conduct of the Cold War we necessarily did wrong things. What emerged in the Cold War by the end was, of course, something absolutely ludicrous, which was a confrontation between fantasies in the defense system particularly. Both sides grossly overestimated the capacity of the other. The Russians probably never had the ability to wage war, only to start it. The CIA's assessment of the Russian capability to destroy the West was vastly overrated and inaccurate. I mean, at one point, 800 ICBMs, when there were only actually 8 that were armed and ready to go. And they would probably never have hit their targets. And conversely, both sides were actually building up this shadow war, which had its extreme expression in the Star Wars concept and so on. I think what happened when we institutionalized the war of stealth was that we really gave the decision-taking process to people in closed rooms. And at that point, they wrote their own dreams. And both sides, from their sealed, smoke-filled fortresses, were forming concepts of one another that were completely inaccurate. And going back to my pompous sermon at the beginning, the trouble was we never came out of those fortresses and really got to know one another. And I get really scared when these new adversarial postures occur and we start quarreling over the Serbian connection with Croatia and so on, the Russian support for the Serbian cause, and you start reading in every editorial the Cold War's beginning again. I think that's nonsense.
You know, I read in the paper the other day that the CIA was evidently thinking of relaunching a whole new spate of covert operations. Do you think we ought to just send the CIA home? Or do you think they have a role to play? And if so, what might that be now?
So the trouble is that there isn't a choice. No politician is ever going to have the nerve to say, get rid of these clowns. Because he cannot go to the electorate and say, I would rather leave us undefended than in the hands of these charlatans. You can't do it, even if that were the case. So, first of all, they're here to stay. Secondly, one must accept that the collection of intelligence, however it's done, is an absolutely essential part of any national entity. We must know as much as possible about what our allies, future enemies, present enemies, future allies are up to in every way we can. And theoretically, the truth shall set us free. But the trouble is that the truth has so many faces in the intelligence game. We are at their mercy, but I think that actually recent experience and a terrible impatience with the intelligence establishment among orthodox governments has reduced their influence. If the CIA is doing that, well, I can well understand that they've got to put together a pretty heavy program for themselves because they were seriously up to question. They looked pretty bad after the Ames affair. And so, what do you do if you're in that kind of trouble? You throw money at the problem and make it bigger.
Do you ever get weary of discussing these questions? I mean, you seem to be, inevitably drawn back to questions of covert operations.
It's my country house. It's the way in which I was brought up to look at the world. And those are the accidents of life. Graham Greene said that our childhoods, we writers, our childhoods, those are our credit balances. And I was swept up very early into Cold War stuff, and I became a little spook, and then a slightly bigger spook. And I got out of it, and it was exactly right for my misshapen mentality that I should have seen the world through that particular arrow slit. And when you start using your mind as a writer in the way an athlete learns to use his body, you get the best hours out of it, you get the best responses out of it, you begin to learn how to juice it up and make it run, then I was always drawing upon that, to me, endless metaphor of the spy. I mean, every artist is some kind of spy, in that he makes observations which are in a sense clandestine. He can't share them. He's got to shape what he finds, make his report, whether he's painting or whether he's making a movie. And it's a very solitary experience. And then he has to sell that illusion, in a sense, to a non-creative world, so that there is something of the secret sovereignty of the artist which is to be found in the spy also, in his vanity. And so it seemed to me, I mean, I've not put on a cloak or drawn my dagger since I was 31. So that's 32 years ago. But it is still the metaphor that I use for looking at the world, for writing about it anyway.
Growing up as you did in a rather disassembled family, with really a brother as an ally, and then being insinuated into these public schools, you must have felt a bit like an imposter,
Yes.
an outsider.
Well, it was Balzacian, really. My father was just such a wonderful paint box from which to draw. But his greatest ambition, well, he really had two. One was, instead of languishing in prison, to become a great judge or a lawyer, to join the other side. And the other,
defector.
the other, having in his own world conspicuously failed to do so, to become one, to turn us into gentlemen. And however it was done. And so we came from very ordinary circumstances, and we were somehow or another forced into or recruited by these Spartan upper middle class schools. And I always felt
This wasn't affirmative action, was it?
well, near enough. But he paid. Somehow he paid. And I always felt, and I think my brother did, that we were complete frauds. But we learnt the language, and we learnt the manners, and we dressed according to the local community, and we passed ourselves off for what we weren't, I think. And then we went back to this chaotic life. And there seemed to be, in those early days in my life, there was no middle ground. It was what the Germans call always a thrust towards an absolute. The pendulum was up that way or up that way. We were either halfway to becoming Franciscan monks, or we were out on the racetrack with my father placing money on horses he couldn't afford to run. It was great.
Well, did this, when you grew older, and this kind of curious double world that you grew up in, when you started going out with women and you got married, had a family, I mean, did you also have this sensation of being someplace you didn't properly belong, or living in two worlds at once?
Sure. It always felt like enemy territory. And it was a perfectly natural transition somehow. Frontiers have always terrified me. And when I went into the secret world, it was really like coming home. And it was an extraordinary business to be that very respectable little schoolboy and then grow up as that person and know the black side of life. We knew the street side. We'd hidden the cars in the garden so that the heavy mob wouldn't come and get them. We'd said Father wasn't in when Father was in. He mixed with some very rough people. And then to get ourselves up in uniform again and go and mix with the real people, or the unreal people, it really was the function of a spy. And I think that paradox, the sort of secret enormity of life, and the constant danger of life, those are things for which I'm terribly grateful. And I think it occurs to me as I speak, it's not something that I thought of before, but actually in most of my books, home is a very dangerous place, because it's where they get you when you come home and where you leave. And I mean, in George Smiley's life, home is where it's worst.
Well, it also has been said of some of your characters, particularly your women characters, that they're trouble, and of course women are usually home.
Well, love and truth and engagement in real life those were things that lay the other side of the dangerous edge. If you're a behaviorist, then it's a very dangerous business to give your heart away. And I expect in those early days, we didn't really know women at all, because my mama had disappeared, and whoever came to the house was likely to be, in the simplest sense, a bird of passage.
Did you know where your mother went?
No, it was a great secret. And if we asked my papa, he would say, "Shh," or "Isn't your old man enough?" And we'd say, "Oh, yeah, you're enough." But we just wondered. But he was unapproachable in that way. It's very hard to explain now. And also that's, I mean, people who have real parents were already members of another world. I don't want to dwell on this too long. It's just about, the interesting thing really is the alienation,
right,
which I believe is the essential condition of most creative people. And I think that really what makes Sammy run, in my case, is that early deprival of the ordinary communications and relationships of life, and that crippling constraint, which is now terribly useful as some kind of, because I've grown up and I think more or less I say what I feel. It's one of the reasons I don't like to give interviews anymore.
We'll get to that.
But it's wonderful to draw upon as an experience. It was a very long sentence.
Well, I think people really enjoy the reflective quality of your characters, as if they're always trying to figure out some of these contradictions to bring these sort of like the split image of a camera lens coming together. I'm wondering if you've ever thought that maybe one of your characters in your books might get psychoanalyzed.
Well, I think that would be the death of him and me. No. I'd do that for myself. I mean, this is my kind of tabletop psychoanalysis. I think I know nothing about psychoanalysis. It terrifies me. I talked to Graham Greene about it. He'd gone into it and come out of it again. It terrifies. The very thought of being normalized appalls me. And you know, it's who wants? But I think if psychoanalysis is about the possibilities of one's nature, then of course it's very close to making character in novels. And if you can, I mean, Scott Fitzgerald's definition of genius, I think, was to have two opposing views on any one subject and still function. Well, if you can actually walk down the street as somebody is so fragmented and draw upon all the possibilities of your own character in order to invent literary character, then you're very lucky.
It's sort of the sand and the oyster.
Yeah, I mean, the choice really was to be a delinquent going on being a spook, just take up crime seriously, or write.
Well, that brings us to the question of writing. Do you consider yourself or view yourself as somebody who cannot but write?
Yeah, I mean, I get, particularly when I'm this side of the world, I get seduced by film, by the notion of film. And also, yes, I could, if I'm between books and available to anyone for anything, then I think film would get me. But actually, I love writing best, and my essays into film so far have been not very successful. I must say that the essays of other people and the films of my books have not been very successful either. So,
film is a bit like dessert. If you get through the meal, you have this promise of something sweet.
Yes.
I mean, it's like after the book, then maybe you have the nice, delightful interlude of sort of fooling around with a film.
Yeah, I mean, the beguiling thing about film, first of all, is that you have company. And if you're writing, you don't. I mean, you share your life with your wife or with whoever you live with, but the reality is that all your decisions are your own, and all your choices and acts of self-examination are conducted in solitude. But movie making does give you the catharsis of a committee, of companionship now and then, and the company of those dreadful young men in ties.
And sometimes without ties and pigtails.
I'm afraid even without. Yes. Yeah.
You are listening to novelist John le Carre in conversation with writer Orville Schell on City Arts of San Francisco, made possible in part by the Columbia Foundation. We'll be back with the second half of our program in a moment. If you would like a copy of this program or a complete catalog of programs in the City Arts of San Francisco series, now available on audio cassette, the number to call is 1-800-595-TALK. That number again is 1-800-595-8255. Our international listeners can reach us at country code USA, area code 707-778-0339. That's 707-778-0339. And now, back to the Herbst Theater.
If you didn't write, do you think you would feel impossible, or do you ever imagine you would get to a point in your life where you'd say, well, enough?
Well, yeah, that worries me. I mean, it's sort of two different questions. If I didn't write, well, I would have painted, I think. I did paint for a while. I did book illustration and stuff. Or I might even, I suppose, have drifted into movie. But now, at 63, if I stop writing, when should I stop writing? I don't know. It's like making love. Somebody else must tell you you're no good, you know.
Well, that doesn't stop people.
No, I mean, you flog on, you try. But I'm scared. I mean, I knew Green a bit. I don't think anybody knew him much more than a bit. But I think that he should have stopped about 5 books earlier than he did. And I used to think you're forgiven your bad books and remembered for your good books. But it is actually, it's a depressing thought that you may have lost it and not know. You see, I really was, I could not have been luckier in all the things that happened to me. I mean, that lunatic early life. And then actually walking straight into the Cold War. Being in Berlin on the spot when the Berlin Wall was being built. Experiencing the absolute high day, the total lunacy of the East-West confrontation. Seeing it end, which I would never have imagined happened. And now having a bit of leftover life to write about. I'm just fascinated by all that. But I suppose I'll be remembered, actually, if at all, as a Cold War writer. But now, unless I get off my backside properly and explore and expose myself to experience, I find that I retrieve memory in a softer way than I would wish. And the purpose of experience at my age is actually to revive memory. The purpose of encounter. We're so good at faces. At mid-60s, you know people very quickly. And that's great. So I feel I know an awful lot about my own trade and how to write. I feel I can do anything. I feel wonderful. But I'm not sure that the performance actually will be will have the cutting edge that I would wish. And I might not know. So I find myself trolleying around, going to unlikely places, and trying to live at the sharp edge more. But it would be an extraordinary thing, actually, to wake up one day and look at the page, or look at the pile of manuscript, and say, I've got to stop. I don't know anybody who's done it.
Well,
I mean, most of us fade gracelessly from the scene, go on too long.
Or stop for a while.
Or stop for a while, yeah.
But it's interesting. I mean, I think once a writer gets in the habit of being a writer, you can't see the world, just sit there and see it. You're always sort of interpreting it and filing it. It's a bit like a photographer.
Yeah, you see it, as it were, through a lens or through the sights of a sniper's rifle, or you definitely, the déformation professionnelle, the distortions that come through the practice of your trade are so upon you that you have no other way of looking at the world. And that's the alarming thing. It's like suddenly realizing you're an actor without a role. So I can't see myself stopping. I have no wish to stop, but I understand the temptation of going on too long.
course, before every book, one does plausibly wonder if there's another one in there that will appear and be a credit to it.
Well, I mean, it is a fact that each book seems to generate industrial waste, which is then available for recycling in the next one. And
the rough block that you want.
Yeah.
Is there anybody that you trust as an editor, as a friend, as just a sensibility to whom you can give things and whose judgment you respect and rely on?
Well, I guess that many people who've been sitting where I'm sitting would give you the same answer, that Robert Gottlieb, who was head of Knopf and then became head of the New Yorker, in my own lifetime was the unique editorial experience. He was the Max Perkins of our time. And Bob's genius is that if you were writing a cookbook or a children's book or a romantic novel or a spy story or whatever, he would apply the criteria of the genre with the same immaculate accuracy that he brings to anything. I mean, he was great. And he was a masterclass of his own. I don't mean to say that he rewrote the books. What he did was, he would say, I do not understand why she was in the woodshed at 3 a.m. And why didn't she cut her hair? I mean, a girl like that wouldn't wear hair like that. Or whatever it is. But he takes the internal logic of the story and hacks it out and drives you mad. But not in any hostile way, just by suggesting you're less than perfect.
Well, it's a dangerous thing to have people who suggest otherwise.
It is indeed. It is.
You mentioned the New Yorker. What in its old guise did that magazine mean to you as a writer and reader?
Well, it was in some ways the last court of decent magazine writing. It was a standard for itself, an impeccable one. It was discreetly brave. It had wonderful literary standards, and its adherence to truth and accuracy was legendary, and rightly so. There was no magazine that I can think of, either side of the Atlantic, that matched it.
Remember that you wrote in a letter to Tina Brown that in a matter of weeks, the tradition of the New Yorker for accuracy and dispassion, excuse me to remind you of this, and calm objectivity have been swept aside. God protect the New Yorker from the English.
That's the mild version of the
And she called you a choleric colonel, incredibly sexist, stuck in the Cold War, and, I might add, in need of a new plot.
Well, it's perfectly true. Yes. Well, we were both right. No, I think objectively I was right and she was rude.
Quite apart from the backwash of the more tawdry elements of British journalism that have drifted up in the shores of America, it seems to me other things equally as depressing and tragic are happening both to publishing and journalism. A kind of a...
Yeah, that's serious. Yes. I mean, tips with Tina are what Tina likes anyway.
Right,
but the decline of the New Yorker is serious, and the decline of publishing, or the changing in publishing, is really, it is something that is extraordinary in my time. I mean, it really is, in my lifetime, my experience of American publishing, it's particularly, let's talk about American publishing, the great tradition of Middle European culture practically bypassed the United Kingdom on its way here. And the great publishing houses, the great Jewish houses of before the war, were the absolute, and the immediate post-war years too, of course, were the best there was. There was no finer publishing tradition than the one that was established here. And you often you say nice things about British erudition, but the reality, in my experience, was that its real home was here, that the cultural tradition had rooted here. And the process of publishing it wasn't gentlemanly or leisurely, but it began with the book and the material, and until it was ready, nobody printed it. And the editorial process was long and thoughtful, and the editing and the accuracy of it all was a matter of pride to the house. Because of the multimedia connections of publishing now, something quite different is required of writers, and I find that really scary. I would find it scary for a kid of mine if he went into writing or she went into writing. I know young writers who've just broken into publishing, made their first or second success, or maybe are making it still, who've done a book and been required by the publishers to go on the road for a year to publicize it. Well, most of us, believe it or not, it seems absurd to say it, such a large, distinguished audience, but most of us are fairly shy people. And that's one reason why we sit in our lonely rooms and write. And it's producing a different breed of self-promoter, self-publicist. And I don't think that sits comfortably at all with the creative business of writing. There's another ridiculous detail of life, but it's worth remembering, that the speed with which a book can be written physically and altered physically on a word processor goes hand in hand with the appetite of publishing to get books out, give them a short life, put the author on the road, and spew the whole thing out again. I don't think I'm just an old man saying the world's getting too fast for me. I think that really is what's happening. So I cherish the small writer, and I think we should be very careful to judge writers by their noble failures too. I mean, you've got Ishiguro coming here in October, and Ishiguro has written, I think, a very brave, enormous, colossal failure. It may turn out to be one of the great books of the century. I may be speaking of Ulysses. The thing is, he did it. He went there. It's a completely uncommercial project. I find that very romantic, and it's becoming quite rare. You have to shoot for success, or you better get out of the game. It's very tough. It's much tougher now than it was.
I think the dilemma is when it's the publisher and the market that is suggesting what success is that the writer has to conform to that creates this dilemma. Well, you don't, as we say, tour.
No, I don't tour. I did it around my 60th birthday. I decided I wouldn't do it anymore. I mean, anything. And I think maybe that's just wanting too late to recover one's innocence. There's a curious passage in the process of writing, in a writer's career, if he has such a thing, that what he writes before he's discovered and fame and money hit him, and what he writes from then on. Because until the moment of discovery, you were making your observations and your comments in secret. And after that, you're doing it under the arc lights. And all your finger exercises, all your little stuff, is pumped up by the system to look like big stuff. There's no such thing as a small book in the, in
the world of big
in the world of big writers. No, not as far as publishers are concerned. So I found increasingly, I don't know what happened. I think in a way, I ran out of sophistry. I found it, which in an old spy is ludicrous, I found it increasingly difficult to pretend.
Did you feel that in some of your earlier books you were doing that?
Yeah, I could, tart around and go on television, and there's appalling chat shows. And it really needs to be sent up a little. We really take it seriously. I mean, this is a world that actually takes Larry King serious. And I mean, we must stop. We really must stop. These are false gods. You know, and I cannot tell you how many times I've appeared on chat shows where you have that hasty conference. It's a great book. I love it. What's in it? and if I ask you this one, will you? Yeah, okay, I'll take care of you. And you discover actually that the interviewee absolutely owns the interview, which is a great comedy. It isn't the interviewer, because he doesn't know what you've written.
Unless, and perhaps you have not suffered this indignity, you have written the questions for him.
No, I've never got that far. But next time
This
I
is
send in
a
a
new
manuscript,
trend.
I'll send, yes.
And I might add,
No.
it sometimes facilitates a more intelligent discussion.
No.
But then, of course, you could be talking to yourself, which might even
That's
be
right.
more
That's
interesting.
right. But the temptation, there's a tape that we play in the family. Unfortunately, it was a radio show, and it was a guy in the. I just found myself completely bomb happy out on the circuit. It was my sort of 5th or 6th book, and I came and did what my publishers wanted, and it was a guy who had a southern audience in Middle America, and it always makes me giggle when people call me John. John, great writer. And then we sat there and we had about 20 minutes, and he was doing black coffee. He looked like Gig Young. Do you remember Gig Young?
Yes.
In They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Remember?
Yes.
He looked absolutely beat up and exhausted, with the sort of traces of handsomeness still written in his face. And louche, debauched beyond belief. The makeup didn't do it all. And
Sounds
it
interesting.
was wonderful. And he said, we sat there like this, watching for the clock to come on. He said, "You married?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Jesus, you okay? It's okay?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "My wife." He said, and then
Too bad this wasn't on the air.
no. And then we came on, and to my astonishment, he sank into a southern accent. I can't do it. "Folks, I haven't slept a week. I've been reading Dan, a little book." And he was presenting my book. And I thought, hang on, a few minutes ago he was telling me he hadn't read it. And he'd enjoyed our conversation. And he decided that we were accomplices. And he said, "You have this moment where he comes through the door with a gun. Now, what the hell made you think of a thing like that?" And I said, "There was no such moment." So I said, I don't know. I was just, I was in the airport one evening. Yeah, you were in the airport. And then I saw this strange fellow with a briefcase come in, and he put the briefcase down, and he was, I guess he was looking for his ticket or his wallet or something. But then I thought, perhaps he's looking for his Jesus, John. That's fantastic. and we just made up the book. And I should have written it after. I mean, it's wonderful. It's like when you've seen the movie of your own book, you feel, well, yeah, I'll go off and write that one sometime.
I'm glad you mentioned the movies, because you, after all, have just arrived here from Los Angeles. Do you enjoy the movies and Los Angeles?
Well, I enjoy the fun, and of course, I mean, it's a cabaret. It's unbelievable. And I enjoy the challenge. I mean, it's, as far as if they're working on your novel, I mean, you are an accomplice to turning an ox into a bouillon cube.
That's flattering.
And then, what does it taste like? Is it tough? It's just too bizarre for words. But you can't help feeling it must be easier than this. But it isn't. But it draws me again and again. And because I got into movies by mistake. With The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, we were, Marty Ritt, who was a great director, who made HUD, and it was really a good director. I think he made a good movie. But he cast Richard Burton in the lead and called me up. I was in Austria writing another book, paying no attention to the movie. And he said, I can't handle Richard. And Richard says, you've got to come over and look after him. And I didn't know what looking after Richard would mean. And they were in Ireland at Ardmore Studios. And he said, Richard won't say his lines. He wants you to rewrite them for him. So I said, well, let me think about it, which in my life means call my lawyer. So I called my lawyer, and he said, you got him over a barrel. You wait. And so I waited, and then some great telephone number was negotiated, and I went over. And in fact, it was like Richard was sort of complaining about the soup. All you had to do was pick the soup up, take it once around the kitchen, put it in front of him, and he said, oh, it's much better. And so we did that with the lines. We took them around the kitchen, turned them around a bit, and he was greatly relieved. The most beautiful experience, if we're talking actors, was Alec Guinness. And I don't know if you saw the Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy on the BBC version or Smiley's People afterwards, but I had 5 wonderful years in all of working with Alec Guinness. Not that I was working with him, but I'd written the books and hung around. I did the script of the second series. And Alec has this sort of memorial voice. And the telephone would go, he gets suddenly, impulsively lonely. And he used to stay at the Connaught in London. Then he would, may I speak to Mr. David Cornwall, please? Hello, Alec, how are you? How did you know it was me? and it was very charming. And he said, I don't think I've ever met a real spy. So could you possibly introduce me to one? So I rang the man who had been head of our CIA, head of SIS, Sir Maurice Oldfield. And he's a short, dapper, fat, North Countryman. And he agreed to meet Alec. And so Alec rings up. I don't know where we should go for lunch. It's got to be somewhere very discreet, hasn't it? And what does one wear? And I said, just grey, Alec, grey, all grey. And so we meet and we have lunch. And they get on these 2 nights like a house on fire. All I'm doing is paying for the meal. And Maurice Oldfield said, I think young David's gone a bit too far with all this spying stuff. Oh, I do agree, says Alec, I do agree. So then, when Oldfield is gone, Guinness watches him go down the road. And watching Guinness watch is wonderful because he's all actor. And we're his zoo. And he needs to know how we walk and everything about us. And he was terribly serious. And he said, now, explain this for me. He said, I've seen people do that. And I've seen people do that. But I've never seen people do that. So do you think he's looking for the dregs of poison? And the lesson is, if you want to be it, be it. And he was a man who wrote his own dreams. He was, but to work with Alec, to see Alec make a scene, work out a scene in his head as an actor, to find out through Alec where the energy is coming from. It didn't have to come from him at all. He often would efface himself in a scene. But he was so senior in relation to everybody else who was making this stuff that he really had almost the directing hand. But it taught one so much about the making of drama, where the focus is in a scene. And I found that was actually a great learning experience, really beautiful. They were lovely things. And writing has given me those encounters. I mean, if I think of 2 days in Leningrad, as it then was, with Sakharov, I think of Arafat, when I was doing The Little Drummer Girl. And it took hours, days, to get to him. I mean, I hung around the PLO office in Beirut. And finally, sitting in the Commodore Hotel in Beirut, eating a kind of 2-foot-long spring roll in the Chinese part of the restaurant, sort of bomb holes and sandbags and things. The waiter came up to me and said, "Our chairman will see you now." I thought, oh, in disgrace with the hotel again. And then I walked out, and there was a sand-colored Volvo waiting, and another one behind it, the chase car, and all these kids with guns. And all of a sudden, we were going through the hot dark of Beirut, looking for Arafat, and we would move from one car to another. And finally, we get up to the sort of 16th floor of a Hilton for beginners with bomb holes in it and all this stuff. And there are all these fighters standing around the wall. And there in the middle of the room is Arafat with the black and white keffir and the designer stubble and the pistol and stuff. And he said, "Mr. David, why have you come to me?" And the voice was pulsing with drama. And I said, "Well, Mr. Chairman, I want to put my hand on the Palestinian heart." And he seized my hand and pressed it against his own bosom and said, "It is here, it is here." And I joined the cause instantly, I would say.
Well, modesty certainly becomes him. Well, David, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
You have been listening to John le Carre, author of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold and Smiley's People, in conversation with writer Orville Schell in a program presented by City Arts and Lectures, Incorporated, for the Friends of the Library. This year, City Arts and Lectures is celebrating 15 years of presenting lectures and onstage conversations with leading figures in literature, criticism, and the performing arts. If you would like a copy of this program or a complete catalog of programs in the City Arts series now available on audio cassette, the number to call is 1-800-595-8255. That number again is 1-800-595-TALK. Our international listeners can reach us at country code USA, area code 707-778-0339. City Arts of San Francisco is produced by Margaret Pick and Pacific Vista Productions in association with KQED-FM for City Arts and Lectures, a Sidney Goldstein and Stephen Barclay production. Technical Director Joe Hunter. Some location recording by Howard Gelman. Theme by Pat Gleason. Special thanks to John Bott and the staff of the Herbst Theater. Until next time, this is Matt Elmore for City Arts of San Francisco on WFMT, the Ideas Network.